we need to revisit and process how hysterical society became as a function of, Mr. Trump going to Washington.
Welcome to the Spencer Leonard Hour. With me, as always, for the Spencer Leonard Hour is Spencer Leonard, historian, Marxist, man about town. Spencer, this week we're going to be talking about John Stuart Mill, and particularly about a conversation between Norman Finkelstein, Ben Burgis, and Matt McManus that occurred on Ben Burgis's podcast, Give Them an Argument. And I'm going to be giving you the opportunity to defend Marx, as they were rather critical of Marx's critique of John Stuart Mill. And I want to say at the outset, I like Mill. I often evoke the harm principle when I'm debating people about the necessity for free speech and defending the First Amendment. But I do think I understand Marx's critique of Mill, and I would agree with it. But let me just see if I can state it flatly, and maybe in a way that's just a gloss and not sufficient. And you can pick it up from there and expand on it or correct me. But my understanding is that Marx critiqued Mill's defense of, he had his economic critique of Mill, and it informs his critique of Mill as a defender of free speech. So what I would say is that Marx believed that Mill's approach to defending the right to free expression was insufficient because he was defending a formal freedom. He was defending a right within a bourgeois context or within a capitalist context. And one way to put it would be, freedom of the press only is significant if you can own a press. Or to put it differently, because of the way the political economy is structured and the way capitalism is founded upon a class struggle, free expression universally obtained can never be realized. It's not that he's against free expression universally obtained, Marx. He, of course, is for it, but just that because of the class basis of society, Mill's defense of free expression is insufficient. Would that be accurate at all, or?
I don't think that Marx really has anything to say, anything to add. I guess what I would say is, where I was, balking at the way that, particularly Norman Finkelstein and Matt McManus, Ben was sort of the interviewer, the way that they were treating Mill, the question is, these are maybe ways that people find obscure. Maybe people find the way I think about things obscure or like historicist or something like that. They're not. Marx has, I think, nothing to add to the liberal defense of free speech. What he has to say about it politically is that socialists can't bargain away their rights in any way, that they have to defend the right of free speech and the right of assembly, etc., right of association, even if that means failing to realize, say, democratic aims, the expansion of suffrage. So we definitely get Marx and Engels, saying to LaSalle and LaSallians, because LaSalle himself dies in a duel prematurely. Look, even if Bismarck is offering you universal suffrage, you can't compromise and support the Bismarckian regime because it is curtailing rights. right? Because it's a
Right.
despotic regime. And the lifeblood of socialist politics is rights, right? It's the right of free speech and so forth. And of course, he knows that the capitalists are always going to be well represented in what's said. I mean, I agree with you, in terms of what you're saying about, there's going to be unequal access to the press. But I don't think that, I guess, Marx would say, look, this is something that the socialist workers movement has to address through its own activity. It has to build up its own organs for publication, which of course historically it did do. There were, in countries where free expression was allowed, there was a socialist press, and Marx wrote for it. And obviously, going back to his earliest experiences, he was defending the right of the press. Of course, his first newspaper was shut down, the Rheinische Zeitung. His press was shut down during the Revolution of 1848. He was accused of, basically thought crimes, of publishing things that were seditious. And he, of course, Marx was a lawyer, that he had a legal training. That's what his degree was in the law. In a philosophical sense, he would have learned, he studied like Hegel's philosophy of right, with a Hegelian, with a Hegel's, one of Hegel's chief students, Gans, Gans. But Marx got up in the court in Cologne and defended himself. And afterward, the jury all got up, they acquitted him, and they all got up and shook his hand, thanking him for his education that he had given them in his final argument, defending himself, which was a substantial defense of the right of free speech. But the point is, the right of free speech is something that goes way back. It goes back into, really the earliest bourgeois revolutionary tradition. So the great English poet, John Milton, who wrote Paradise Lost, was a revolutionary Republican in the English Civil War. And he wrote, it's called Areopagitica. It's a reference to to a hilltop where free debate was allowed. And he talks about, the core arguments of the right of free speech, were made, and of course were rehearsed by the likes of Voltaire. The Enlightenment is a constant struggle for publication. If you learn about the kind of the social history of the Enlightenment, they have to publish illegally. They have to publish in the Netherlands, and then they smuggle books inside the covers of Bibles, or at the bottom of other shipments of goods, and the books have to be sold illegally, and people are imprisoned for what they say. Like Diderot is famously the editor of the encyclopedia. He had a footnote in the encyclopedia where, under like the discussion of the Lord's Supper, of the right, the Christian right of eating the body and drinking the blood of Jesus. And at the bottom, like in the encyclopedia entry, it refers you to other articles. And Diderot had C, cannibalism.
Yeah.
Right. So he did things like that got him in trouble, and they had to ghostwrite stuff. Of course, the struggle for the right of public, the Stamp Act, that the Americans struggled against, was in part a question of the right to publish, right? Because you had to publish on stamped paper, right? So there was a stamp on knowledge, there was a tax on knowledge, there was a tax on newspaper publication, and that in effect was the state giving, authorizing the press because they could deny the stamp. And so, I think that Marx would say, look, John Stuart Mill's argument on liberty, because, and he's writing in 1859, and he does know, and he does say in that book, like, look, I'm not just arguing against state censorship. I'm arguing against social censorship. Right. In that sense, he's arguing, against like what we might call cancellation. People who don't, who want to shut down, the village idiot, or, the village atheist, or the eccentric, or, the people who have minority opinions. And, they want to argue, well, they shouldn't have. So we see this all the time, like public pressure on, or sort of tacit pressure on publishers, right? Not to publish certain opinions. The government's not involved, right? But society, I mean, the government could be involved, right? I mean, obviously
nowadays there's no way. I mean, theoretically, the government's not involved, right? I mean,
it's just that he would say, well, of course the government shouldn't be involved,
right?
But you can have a kind of imposition of conformity, right? As a result of, in a sense, majoritarian pressure, right? And so it's really a critique of, what Nietzsche would call a kind of herd morality. It's a critique of democracy in that way, and I don't think that Finkelstein they talk about it. They do talk about it, and they know the book, but Mill knows that he's, he would treat it as going beyond the old argument. Just as he would view, and Matt would view, and Norman would view Mill's socialism, his sort of socialist political economy and so forth, as going beyond liberalism. Right. And so, what's really at issue is, does Marx really think that this is going beyond? Right? Is socialism just going beyond liberalism? Is liberalism just this defense of private property and narrow possessive individualism, and individualism is the problem? You hear these kind of progressive attitudes, and what's interesting to me is to see this kind of former Maoist / anarchist, right? Because, what is Norman Finkelstein, right? On the one hand, he's a self-professed former Maoist. On the other hand, he's the self-professed disciple of Noam Chomsky, the anarchist. And he's also, a convert to liberalism in this Millsian way, because, he discovered Mill after the fall of the Gang of Four, and after all of his, Maoist political illusions collapsed. So we have another example of some kind of, anti-liberal, or we need a new kind of liberalism. We need like a socialist liberalism. We need a liberalism that goes beyond the old possessive, the bad old bourgeois days. shared by, former Stalinist and neo-social democrat Matt McManus, right? And, what I wanted to talk to you about is, why does Marx not think that John Stuart Mill, who is advancing beyond, in his own mind, progressing beyond his father's utilitarianism and the old Enlightenment inheritance, he declares himself the Adam Smith of the 19th century in his Principles of Political Economy, which of course Marx just heaps contempt on. Right. He's the, basically what they got upset about in that podcast, they sort of jumped right out of the gate with this, is they think Marx is unfair to John Stuart Mill. And what's important, in my riposte to that is, you're not understanding what John Stuart Mill stands for Marx, right? For Marx, John Stuart, he says it in the, in the very famous discussion in the afterword to the second edition, where Marx talks about dialectics. And he says, John Stuart Mill and a man named Bastiat, who is a kind of libertarian, both of whom published in 1848. These guys typify what I'm calling vulgar political economy. Or elsewhere, Marx would say John Stuart Mill typifies the disintegration of the Ricardian system. Why does Marx make a distinction between bourgeois ideology, which is a misleading rubric? Because what he means,
because what we think of as ideology is like propaganda, or is what he would call vulgar.
Right. What he means by it is the highest expressions of human thought in the bourgeois epoch. Right. And the bourgeois epoch, of course, is the era of the emergence of bourgeois society. And when it has come into being, and the commodity form, which is the social, the social relation of bourgeois society, has become generalized, in its very generalization, in the very realization of freedom, in that sense, that freedom becomes self-contradictory. It comes to contradict itself. And the expression of that is something Marx calls the class struggle, which emerges in the 1820s and 30s. And is unmistakably arrived by the 1840s. And so for Marx, all of the great discoveries of political economy are culminating in a figure like Ricardo. Just like bourgeois philosophy culminates in Hegel. Right? And there isn't any advance on Hegel, right? What there is a disintegration of Hegel's system by brilliant people. Brilliant people try to advance the Hegelian system. They try to advance philosophy in the 30s and 40s. They're called the Young Hegelians. And Marx says, look, they end up falling below the threshold of Hegel. Similarly, bourgeois political economists, or political economists who try to advance the Ricardian system, they end up falling below the threshold of bourgeois ideology. And he means by that both on the left and the right. And he doesn't think that he's exactly immune from that. Right? It's not that Marx has a better way to do it. What he knows is that what you're doing when you're trying to advance political economy is you're trying to advance a science of a society that has become self-contradictory. And so what's crucial for Marx so it's that consciousness which is expressed as a negative dialectic that shows freedom disintegrating, right? People trying, so you'll hear, you talk to Chris about this kind of stuff all the time, right? You and I have talked about this. Like, nobody cares about people. The political economy was the language in which socialists tried to advance their thinking. Right? They thought, like, we want what Adam Smith is talking about. Like we want to own our labor. We want to be independent. Right? We want to have the dignity of work. And yet when we try to advance that, when we try to negotiate the sale of our commodity, which of course increasingly in the 19th century comes to require unionization, right? The union, you have to, the working class has to organize collectively in order for the individual worker to own their own labor, right? They only can become owners of their labor in the sense of owners of a commodity, the sale of which they can be parties to a contract of, right? That they can negotiate the value of their labor. They can only do that with other workers, right? And in that context, that's that of course creates a political situation, right? When the workers begin to form a class in and for themselves, the capitalists come to be a class in and for themselves as well. And that becomes a crisis of liberalism. It becomes a crisis at the level of property right. Right? Marx talks about this in Capital when he says, when right meets right, force decides. Right? And he's talking about a contradiction. Right? This is something that someone like Matt McManus is extremely unclear about, because he thinks, that the liberal defense of private property is a defense of the capitalist's right.
Right.
It's not just a defense of the capitalist's right. It's a defense of the workers' right in the people that in the thinkers that McManus will dismiss as what he calls possessive individualists. Right. So these people try to divide through the Enlightenment and say these are the good Enlightenment thinkers and these are the bad guys, and so they don't like John Locke, but they like Hegel, right? They don't take Marx would never do this, right? Marx takes the whole Enlightenment, just like Hegel takes the whole epoch of modern philosophy, right? And Hegel thinks, like, of course, he may think that Locke is overrated or he's not or whatever, but he sees it all as one thing. And it's an argument not just for the rights of the individual, but this is the freedom that falls out again in Matt, the historical right to transform society.
Yeah, I wanted to mention a conversation I had with Ben Burgis about a year and a half ago, I think it was, when
on this channel.
On this channel, yeah. It was during, originally it was during a 15-hour live stream to celebrate the 15th year anniversary of the Diet Soap podcast. And he was one of the many people who came on during that 15-hour. Seemed like 15 years. And we discussed the Twitter files, of course, is what I got stuck on for quite a while. I still mention often, and and in the course of the
definitely relevant.
Yeah.
John Stuart Mill would be helpful.
Yeah.
Sure.
In the course of that conversation, I said to him, look, he was arguing for the necessity to make the social media companies state run. And I said to him, look, you can't only think about this in terms of the rules or the guidelines. I think I said something like this. I said, one of the things that we have to hold on to is actually property rights here, because property rights are really the foundational right of freedom and freedom of speech as well. So I know that seems contradictory, but I think the origin, like the real foundation of property rights, is the right of labor to the products of its own labor and its own activity. So that is the foundational property right in our society, and we can't abandon it, and we can't turn it over to the state. We can't say, okay, the state's going to be able to dictate to everyone what the rules are to maintain free expression. You can't take the First Amendment and make it a guideline or turn it into a stamp that you put on paper, right? Because the reality is that is a negative right, free expression. It is a restriction on the state. It is not a positive right in society. The First Amendment, I mean. Our right to free expression is something else, something we maintain through our right to ourselves and our own activity. So that's what I said to him, and he just said, I think you've become too much of a libertarian, and he meant that in the kind of American right wing sense, and it became a real conflict. Like voices were raised in that conversation.
I'm not sure that I like the language of negative and positive.
Right. I saw your eyebrows go up when I said it that way, but correct me.
Right. There's it's a kind of an Isaiah Berlin formulation. I do think the right of free speech is it's social because it's individual. Your right to speak is also society's right to hear you. And society's right to hear you is tied to society's right and necessity to change, and to change in the light of reason. And for German idealism, shall we say, as a culmination of a massive amount of thinking of Montesquieu, of Hume, of Adam Smith, of crucially Jean-Jacques Rousseau, themselves building on the 17th century Enlightenment, Descartes, Locke, Spinoza. All of our practices are simultaneously, are reflective practices. So we're not just doing, we're doing, and we're thinking about what we're doing, and the way that we think about it's changing what we're doing. And in that sense, freedom sparks off in every dimension of life, in every dimension of society. It sparks off in every relationship. Every relationship poses moral questions about how we want to how do we want to conduct our relationships, right? On the one hand, I will be a husband to my wife the way my father was to my mother, but at the same time, in the practice of my relationship to my wife, we're going to renegotiate what it is to be a husband and wife, right? In light of the moral questions that the categorical imperatives that are sparking off in every aspect of our lives, right? And in that sense, and of course that gets formalized, right? We have talk shows about how husbands should treat their wives and wives their husbands, and we have YouTube videos about it, and we have magazine articles about it in the magazines that are sold in the grocery store, and we, just as we have parenting magazine, and we have long conversations about what it is to be a friend, and we read about marriages and friendships and relationships in novels, right? In which we all recognize ourselves, even though they're completely particular circumstances for fictional people. Right. So whatever it is, like we're watching some television drama, society's constantly reflecting on itself, and that up to and including formal discussions about what the law should be. Right. And so I would say that you can't turn it off, right? It's what it means to say that this society is philosophical, right? Or Marx famously writes, philosophy has become worldly, right? He's commenting on bourgeois philosophy, right? Bourgeois philosophy has become only about freedom, and those discussions and that question of philosophy, is ultimately about the freedom of society as a whole to evolve, right? And the question of capitalism is about the crisis of that. It's about the crisis of that freedom. It's about precisely how our progress and how our constant generation of new ways of living and new ways of producing and new ways of relating to each other, such that all that is solid melts into air, and all fixed, fast, frozen relations dissolve before they can ossify. That freedom is itself the mask or the fundamental ideological appearance of the crisis of freedom, that things changing all the time and human progress is what's masking stagnation and regress,
right?
And social disintegration. And that's the issue of the relationship of liberalism to Marx.
So explain to me again why Marx wasn't being unfair to Mill. I know I want to put it all together here, if you can.
Okay.
Mill, let me see if I can state it. It's from what you've said so far.
Please.
Okay. Mill believed that the bourgeois freedoms had been fully achieved, and what was necessary was to move beyond them. Because he saw the problems in bourgeois society as stemming from problems in political economy, and he wanted to fix that with his political economy. Whereas Marx believed that no, the problems were in society as it came into contradiction with itself, and rather than correcting the bourgeois economists or the bourgeois philosophers, we needed to use that as our starting point as we operated within the world, rather than and in politics, rather than remaining at the level of thought and trying to perfect our thinking. Is that roughly correct?
Yeah, I mean, if I were to put it very simply, right, Marx, in that afterword to the second edition of Capital, it's the place where Marx talks about, the Germans treat Hegel as a dead dog, like that very famous bit, where he talks about John Stuart Mill as a kind of, Vulgar political economist.
Mm-hmm.
What he says is that, he's a syncretist. So he's a liberal who knows about unemployment and bad wages and the worker struggle.
Mm.
And so he wants to patch things up.
Mm.
Right. And of course, this is, where we start to think about like people supporting, progressive capitalism.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So, people see the problem with unemployment and they say, just to take a very basic phenomenal expression of the crisis of capitalism, the crisis of bourgeois society in capital. They look at a problem like unemployment and they say, well, we need welfare.
Yeah, unemployment insurance.
We need unemployment insurance, or we need a UBI, or, AI is coming. So we're going to have to, deal with all of these people and who aren't going to be able to get wage labor jobs.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to have wage labor and we're going to have welfare.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to have a lot of laws about the length of the working day. We're going to regulate capital.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to provide, robust welfare state provisions. I mean, this is basically, kind of a McManus vision, mm-hmm. right? It's the logic of Jacobin and the DSA supporting the Democrats, mm-hmm. right? For Marx, what that obscures is the crisis of the social relations. Right? Like, how are we going to overcome these social relations? Right? Adam Smith and David Ricardo saying, look, this society is based on wage labor.
Mm-hmm.
They're not wrong. And what you're doing is you're fudging that. You're trying to smooth that over. You're trying to smooth the rough edges off of that as that's entering into crisis. Right.
Mm-hmm.
But you will never, you will create a problem. Of course, you will create a problem of the people who work resenting the profits that they generate, that their labor generates, being used to pay welfare. Of course they will. Of course, they'll say these people are degenerate. They'll come up with racist ideas about it. They'll come up with all sorts of reasons why, because they are right to say we participate in society and those people are parasites. And they have become friends of the state. They are allied to the state because the state pays their, for them to live. And therefore, they are no longer our allies in freedom struggles against the state.
Boy,
all kinds of problems arise from this that
mm-hmm.
This kind of, quote, liberal socialism just won't address. And Marx is saying, no. Right? We, fine, let it be free trade. Let it be, let capitalism rip, whatever. We don't support the state taking care of the working class's problems at all. Now, I know I'm not addressing it in the terms that you put it, but to put it more, more like textually, historically, Marxologically,
mm-hmm.
For Marx, what happened is that in the wake of the French Revolution, basically, bourgeois social relations were unleashed upon the world, right? They were unleashed by the revolution. They were even unleashed in the counter-revolution which had to take a kind of a liberal form. You can think about like a country like Germany, which fought against Napoleon, but in so doing had to make all kinds of liberal concessions, right? So in the age of bourgeois revolution from 1776 to the end of the French Revolution in 1815, politically, freedom is unleashed on the world. The great thinkers like Rousseau and Smith and Thomas Jefferson and Immanuel Kant were the thinkers of that. After that, you get kind of the last statements of liberalism, like Hegel, who's a late thinker, right? Who's really not going beyond Kant, but is kind of elaborating Kant. And he's at a fundamental level, especially in something like the Lectures on the Philosophy of History, saying more or less explicitly, like, look, you think the revolution was defeated, but it wasn't, because they can't put the genie back in the bottle, right? Spirit is unleashed in the world, right? We've substantially advanced self-consciousness of spirit in a way that can't be reversed. And people like Constant say the same thing. In that moment of kind of late Ricardo, Hegel, Constant, you can think of like Jacksonian movements in the United States. Socialism emerges. Socialism is really a form of bourgeois thought in like 1800, 1808, people like Fourier, Saint-Simon, 1810s, Robert Owen. And they're kind of like the other side of this late liberalism. And Marx treats the whole thing as one. And he says, basically, all honor to Hegel and to the utopian socialists. Right? He loves Fourier, he loves Hegel, right? He loves all of it. That was a moment of the sort of the last gasp of liberalism. But that socialist idea has been transformed and deepened and proletarianized with the emergence of the socialist workers movement in the 30s and 40s. These old socialist trends, which really had nothing to do with labor. Fourier and Saint-Simon, these guys aren't really talking about the working class at all, right? They're just saying this society is totally hypocritical. And, it says it's about peace. It's really about war. It says it's about, happiness, but it's really about misery. It says it says marriage is about love, but it's really a prison. Like all these things that Fourier says, right? Mill is influenced by these socialists who are saying, this thing doesn't really work out, and there's crime, and there's what they would have called pauperism. And so Mill becomes a radical. He becomes a radical Democrat. And this is the beginnings of progressivism. And this transforms the Liberal Party in Britain. And what Marx's critique is, but this society has produced symptoms, expressions that ultimately aren't just unfulfilled needs, like the working class movement for socialism isn't something that it can just answer with a policy or something like that, but rather concentrates within it what's at the root of this disintegration of liberalism, right? The working class, the proletariat, the working class becoming self-organized and thereby becoming the proletariat under conditions of industrialization, is, in advancing its aims, deepening the contradictions of society. Right? If it gets higher wages and it gets shorter work hours, it produces more unemployed workers that can then undermine those wages and those work hours. And so the working class itself comes to be in contradiction with itself, right? The proletarian condition is a contradiction. And that itself is driving a movement towards democracy. So democracy likewise is a symptom of capital for Marx. John Stuart Mill's just saying, let's get more democratic, have more representation of the poorer orders, and address their needs through the state. And in that sense, he's an agent of Bonapartism. Right? This is what McManus just doesn't confront. Right? Bonapartism, the Bonapartist state is a kind of socialism. Right? Louis Bonaparte himself is a socialist. He's a Saint-Simonian too, just like John Stuart Mill. And he's just like John Stuart Mill. He's a degenerate expression of what was once an authentic symptom of society, Simonian himself. So I don't. So it is this kind of strange argument about understanding history, right? Understanding that for Marx, something has changed in society, such that the old project. It's not that the old project was lame, or the old project had some problem. The old project of the self-emancipation of bourgeois society is wholly to be affirmed, and we have to recognize in the past, historically, right, it's created our situation.
I'm going to ask you.
We're going to demand, the problem is that we're going to keep trying to renew the bourgeois revolution. We're going to keep trying, in the face of crisis, we're going to try to reboot. And Marx is saying, when we start to repeat the revolution, either we prosecute the contradictions within it, or we reconstitute the problem. Sorry, go ahead.
I want to ask you, why was Mill not Marx, or not a Marxist? Why could Marx be Marx and Mill was a degenerated? Why could, and I'm not asking you like to look into Marx's brain and tell me, which neurons were different from Mill's. I am asking you, like, what was it about their political commitments or their social standing or their role in society that generated Mill on the one hand, who fell below his influences, and Marx on the other, who at least tried to maintain the level of his influences?
I think that Marx and Engels experienced, call it capital, in a very fundamental way as young men. Marx is born, I believe, in 1818. So the moment of the emergent, the moment of the emergence of sort of full-blown working class socialism would have been basically his 21st birthday. When Marx turns 21, he's dealing with the emergence of a mass working class movement in Great Britain, the first one, Chartism, which is something that he experiences crucially through Engels. It's at the absolute core of his friendship with Engels that Engels has seen this and participated and written for and gotten to know the leaders of Chartism, right? That's expressed in Engels's book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, which is the reason why Marx becomes his friend. It's shown in that movie, The Young Marx, where Engels and Marx meet, and they're sort of wary of each other, and they're like, like two young bucks. But, Marx says, that thing you wrote, that's amazing, right? And the other thing that Engels writes is he writes a critique of political economy in 1843, before Marx had ever thought about it, because he knows that political economy is the language in which socialism is trying to figure out its problem, its question, right? Through all these left Ricardians in England, which Engels is clued into. Otherwise, Engels' critique of political economy is extremely crude, but it's a formulation of this question. And so I don't think, so Mill is the older man. Mill was, what's interesting about him, I guess, is that his father is a really important guy, right? And if you read John Stuart Mill's autobiography, his father basically clones himself in his son. It's nuts, the way he educates his son. He's got his son reading Greek by age 6 and 7. Right. He doesn't let him go to school. He doesn't let him hang out with other boys because the other boys are going to make him dumb. Right. And he turns his son into, his son just hangs out with David Ricardo and with Jeremy Bentham. Right. And of course, James Mill himself. And he's a brilliant young, scion of radical philosophy in England, of utilitarianism, which of course was radical and deeply influenced the socialist workers movement. And James Mill was very close friends with Francis Place, who was the guy in whose front room the People's Charter was written in 1839. So so Mill is an interesting kind of figure, just like Marx is a kind of spiritual son of Hegel. John Stuart Mill is kind of the literal son of James Mill and the adopted son of Ricardo. But in between, because Marx is a bit of a man, he kind of sees the people who are about 10 years older than him trying to figure out this whole crisis of the older liberalism, the crisis of the older utilitarianism, the crisis of the Hegelian system, the crisis of French liberalism. And so he looks at people like Moses Hess and Bruno Bauer and of course David Strauss and all of these young Hegelians. And that's where Marx is kind of cutting his teeth. And so I would say that Marx experiences, before he experiences Chartism and socialism directly, he experiences being younger and watching these older men, I'm older than the first generation of platypus or something, a half generation older, 10, 12 years older. And he sees them trying to be Hegelians. And he realizes, this thing is not working. And what it is, the only way that we can advance Hegel, the only way that we can be children of our time in thought, the way that Hegel describes the philosophical task of being a child in time, being a self-consciousness of your own time, right? Being the product of your own time and being the self-conscious product of your own time, is to recognize a new situation has emerged. So there's something, I don't know, sui generis, there's something like splendidly original about Marx and Engels. There really is. They're just surrounded by brilliant people. For the most part, they're wrongly forgotten. I taught a reading group for Platypus over the summer on the pre-Marxian socialists. And, one of the things that you realize the deeper you get into Marx and Marxism is that the failure of Marx and Marxism doesn't just mean that you can't understand Marx and Marxism anymore. Like Matt McManus is trying to get Marx from like David Harvey or from Etienne Balibar or for all these new leftists, basically, all these so-called interpreters who are really obstacles to understanding Marx, even as you might have to work through them. Not only do you not understand Marx, Marxism, Lenin, etc., but an immense amount of history falls away. So, for instance, the Revolution of 1848, nobody knows anything about it. Knows anything about it. Nobody thinks of, like, say, the U.S. Civil War as part of the aftershock of the Revolution of 1848, or a kind of a late expression. They can't think in these terms anymore. And they also can't think about the intellectual environment that produced Marx and Engels. Like, nobody reads the stuff that like 19th century socialists just would have had at their fingertips. Saint-Simon, Fourier, Robert Owen, the Chartists, right? All of this stuff that you would, Proudhon, right? Young Hegelians, Feuerbach, people would have known these things. Right. And that whole history, like, you studied philosophy, right? Right. You go up to Hegel. Maybe if you
don't get to Hegel, go up to Kant. That's what I did.
Well, that's good. Right. Chris would probably tell you that's enough.
Kant, no, he's wrong. But Kant was dismissed because it was being taught by analytic philosophers. So what I learned about Kant was that he doesn't make any sense and forget him. When I was being taught this in a philosophy course, it was not about world philosophy. It was about epistemology and ontology and those kinds of things.
Right. I'm sure you only read the first critique.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a problem. That's the way I was taught Kant too. Really, if you get down to it, nobody cares about Hegel except Marxists. And so the reappropriation of Marx and his own self-understanding is actually a reconstitution of history itself. I know that sounds insane, but it's actually true. Right? If you can't think about the centrality if you can't think about the actuality of the crisis of liberalism, expressed through the young John Stuart Mill, or expressed through the utopian socialists or the young Hegelians. If you can't think through that, then you can't think through the emergence of socialism. Right? You can't understand that Marx isn't the beginning of socialism. Marx is the critic of socialism. He's the immanent dialectical critic of an already existing movement. You can't understand the centrality of the non-event, of the non-revolution that was 1848. What does it mean that all of a sudden revolutions don't advance us any further? That, as Marx puts it, no new ground is conquered for society, but rather you get imperialism. You get Louis Bonaparte, right? These things, right? These questions that ultimately force you back beyond the 20th century, into a deep recognition of like, what is this problem of capital and what was Marxism, right? They are absolutely necessary to understand, just where we are in history, just like to reconstitute a historical consciousness. Right. And so that's really what's and this drives, and I like Matt, and I like to consider him a friend. I mean, I'm certainly not an enemy, to any person who's grappling with these ideas. But he gets extremely frustrated because he's like, well, what are you arguing? What is your point? Right. And I'm like, the historical consciousness is the problem. Right, a category of like vulgar political economy is a category of historical consciousness for Marx, right? You just can't advance Ricardian political economy, and you can't change the subject or try to patch it up with welfare and whatever. Right, you have to face you have to face our circumstances with sober senses, right? You have to face that actually our situation's self-contradictory in history, in the 19th century. Not our ideas, not just the dialectic or the situation that the dialectic is expressing, right? And Matt just is like, well, that's just not an argument. In other words, like Marx isn't exactly like, he doesn't really have, it's like when you say to people, like, well, Marx doesn't really have a criticism of Adam Smith. And they're like, well, what are you talking about? And he's like, Marx's point is, if you try to run the Adam Smith program in the 1840s, it's self-contradictory.
Right.
If you try to do it, if you try to reboot it, and then you just become some kind of libertarian, free trade, private property, invisible hand caricature of Adam Smith, the philosopher of society, which is what Marx will insist he remains. Right. No, and so this is what, like, go ahead.
I'll just say, it does seem to me that you do have an argument, that it's just not a simple one, that it requires taking on board a lot of different pieces.
It's not just a matter of like having a different premise or drawing different conclusions from the same premises, right? It, like, logically, it's not just an argument.
If you believe, as Marx did, that religion and ideology and culture and politics are all founded upon the production and reproduction of society socially, then your story makes sense, because you can see that the religion or the ideologies, philosophy, economics, what have you, were founded upon a way of life that was coming into being as bourgeois society, that then was transformed by bourgeois society at the level of material production, at the level of how we reproduce our lives every day. And that didn't just mean like, we changed from piecework to factory work or something like that, but it also changed the character of the state. It changed the character of our philosophies. And you can't go back to the previous epoch and when our social lives were run differently and use those same ideas again.
The tricky thing is, that what Marx thinks about, say, the centrality of the economy, like, isn't true for other epochs, right? Or it is and it isn't, right? In the sense that, and it's a doubled problem, right? Because the bourgeois thinkers think that society is essentially economic, right? Adam Smith is making that argument for the philosophy of his day. And he's making that argument, he's not just making it he's not making an economist's argument. He's making a moral philosophical argument That's how he understood himself, and he understood himself correctly. And he says our society is a commercial society, and our social relations are bound, that every man is a merchant, even if all he has to sell is his own labor. And he understands our society as economic in the sense that it's essentially cooperative, and that's his categories of division of labor and so forth. Mm-hmm. And Marx, and people get really confused because they'll say dumb stuff like, oh, the Enlightenment's idealist, right? Like Hegel completely agrees with Adam Smith. He understands that there is a collective, that we have a division of labor, and that we're collectively, in a sense, metabolizing nature through production and thereby reproducing society in history, and that's absolutely fundamental for how our law works and how our religious ideas work and everything else. Mm-hmm. He agrees with that. They're all materialists. Like, in that sense, like that's a super. Marx. I just want to say that the economic problem is like a little bit different. It gets a twist in the crisis of bourgeois society, because the crisis is expressed economically. The crisis is expressed as an antagonism between classes. Within the third estate, within society itself. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say. Okay, what was I going to say? I was going to say that if you think about the move to economism, or the move to conceiving of society on the basis of its productive activity and reproductive activity as being the foundation, you can retroactively look back on other forms of life and see that that's the case. But what you can't do,
you're compelled to do it, actually.
Yeah, you can, and you're compelled to do it. But what you can't see in those previous forms was the self-reflection on that reality and the freedom to change that reality that emerged through the bourgeois revolutions. The freedom of labor is what's not present in previous historical periods. And
or you could or you can say the bourgeoisie is the class that's always rising. You can look at the whole of human history as stages in the emergence of bourgeois consciousness, right? I mean, that in fact is exactly what Hegel's doing, right? So I would say, I just would point out, it gets like super arch. Right. And Marx has his like wild, eyebrows and his crazy hair, right, and the fire from his fingertips and, from his eyes when he says something as insane as the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle.
Right.
Right. That is like an arch Hegelian statement. Right? Because class struggle is the meaning of my time. It's the meaning of all time. Right? Even though you will be very hard pressed to go, rummaging around in the records of like whatever 7th century medieval France and trying to find the class struggle.
Right. Right.
Yeah, I mean, believe me, Marxists do it, right? Like there's, the 20th century is no end of these attempts. But it's actually, people have missed the twinkle in Marx's eye.
Right. Well, I mean, it's in On the Concept of History in Walter Benjamin, again, more explicit, right?
It is.
Because he's saying,
and this conversation picks up on that one in this way.
Right. Because he's saying our present is what gives us access to the past. So the past arrives to us as a constellation of failed revolutions, failed moments, struggles for freedom, which we have to realize now through an intervention, through revolutionary struggle. And that's the only way we can know the past. If we try to go back to the past and just think of it as it was then, we're going to pollute it. We're going to misrecognize it. We're going
or you can flip it in the spirit of Benjamin, right? Our knowledge of the past is our only access to the present.
That's true too. Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
That's
it's
right.
When you try to get young people to understand that, all those people with their crazy wigs in the 18th century and, these weird people in black and white photographs and, the film footage that doesn't seem like it's the right speed from the 1910s, like that's actually them. Right. That's flowing through us. Right. And it's the struggles. It's the struggles for freedom of the past that demand to be vindicated. Ultimately, the struggle for socialism is about redeeming the past. It's more than the future. Right.
Right. And Benjamin says that as well.
That's absolutely. That's a Benjaminian thought. I think that, the problem, what you get with Stalinism, Finkelstein style, obviously Stalinism in distress, Stalinism disavowed, Stalinism, flipped on its side, in its actual, it's dialectical opposite, but it's dialectical obverse, anarchism, right? Party, no party, right? Or the frank, and if you press Matt, he's quite straightforward. He doesn't believe in abolishing the state, right? He's a Milibandist. He's a Bernsteinian, right? He doesn't claim to be an orthodox Marxist. He claims to be a reformist. I would just ask him to be a bit more consistent about that, because I think reformism repudiates Marx. It repudiates the legacy of independent socialist parties, ultimately, in favor of administering and ameliorating capitalism through liberals gaining state power and instituting welfare states. Right? It becomes.
I want to jump off right from there in the second half, because the Russiagate scandal that's emerging now is a scandal of the amelioration of the contradictions of capitalism by the administrative state. That is what it is.
Cool.
Don't you agree? Yeah.
I'm going to ask you to elaborate that thesis in the second half.
Okay, I will. All right, I will tell you what I mean. Thanks. If you enjoyed this conversation, please do consider supporting us on Patreon. Our patrons help to make sure that Sublation Media can continue to provide interviews, videos, books, and articles that are critical of the left from the left. If you are tired of remaining stuck within bourgeois ideologies and politics, help us sublate them both.